From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon. Welcome to the Library of Congress. I'm John Cole. I'm the director of the Center for the Book in the Library of Congress, which is the library's reading promotion arm. We promote books and reading and literacy in libraries around the country through a network of state centers for the book. And we have reading promotion partners, which are nonprofit organizations that we also work with the same cause in mind. We often have special projects with a number of our national partners. Here in Washington, we're deeply involved with the National Book Festival each year, including last year we had our 10th anniversary National Book Festival, and we will be launching this year's in September. Our hoped-for date is September 24th, which I hope we can confirm today. It's penciled in, but we need to get a number of confirmations before we can proceed. Here at the library, we also sponsor these talks, Books and Beyond, which are talks that are by authors of new books that have some kind of special connection with the Library of Congress, either drawing on our collections or in a subject that has come out of a project with the Library of Congress, or in this case, one that also is of not only interest to the library because of our collections, but because of the history of the District of Columbia. We're proud that in our state center system, we've included D.C. We actually have 52 state centers. The 51st is the District of Columbia, and the 52nd is the Virgin Islands. So that's, we hope, our first state center in the territories. We work with the territories actually through the National Book Festival, so that's another way to build support for books and reading. We're fortunate today to have Kate Masur, who is from Northwestern University, here to talk about her book, An Example for All the Land, Emancipation and the Struggle Over Equality in Washington, D.C., which was published by the University of North Carolina Press earlier this year. This is a book signing as well as a presentation, and once Kate has made her presentation and has allowed for questions and answers for perhaps 10 or 15 minutes, we will start the book signing, and we would like to get it started no later than 1 o'clock. So I will be happy to bring her up in just a moment. All of our talks at the in Books and Beyond, as well as at the Book Festival, are videotaped for later presentation on the Library of Congress's website, and this talk is no exception. So I invite you to turn off all things electronic, and to tell you that during the question and answer period that we hope that any question you ask is actually giving us permission to use, if we like, your question and your comments on the edited version of the webcast once it appears. Kate is an assistant professor of history and African American studies at Northwestern. Her new book has been very well received, and I hope she says a word or two about the resources that she used, as well as talking about this topic. And she has delved into this topic in an original and thorough way, and we're very pleased that she can be with us. This presentation also has a presence on Facebook. I should say that our new Books and Beyond Club, Facebook club, offers an opportunity for people to not only look back on some of the talks that we've had, but to look forward and to put comments on it and to engage in conversations about some of the books that have been presented and will be presented in Books and Beyond. It's my pleasure now to present Kate Masur. Kate?
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, John, and thanks to Ann Boney and the Center for the Book for having me here. And thanks to everyone for coming out. I know sometimes when there's an inch of snow on the ground, it can be hard to go places in Washington. I say that with my Chicago area machismo. Sorry. So it's, I feel particularly honored and delighted to be here at the Library of Congress talking about this book. I feel I owe the library a huge debt of gratitude. Along with the National Archives, I would say that the Library of Congress has been the most important institution for sustaining the research that I've been doing since I was in graduate school. I feel like it's been a really evolving relationship. I was thinking back on when I first moved to Washington as a graduate student in 1998, and I lived in a basement of a townhouse on Capitol Hill. I rode my bike to the Library of Congress. I didn't really know anything about how this place worked. And all I could really think to do after I got my research card was go to the Jefferson room and read books, or sort of pretend to read books that I could have otherwise checked out at the University of Michigan Library. In other words, I really didn't. I feel like I went through a process of acclimation where the first thing to do was just treat it as a library, in the way that I knew how to use libraries. And it was only gradually that I came to really understand the remarkable nature of the collections here and the diversity of the collections here. So I quickly branched into the newspaper reading room. I'm just going to say a couple of things about how I use the collections, and then I'll come back to that throughout the talk. But I branched into the newspaper reading room, reading Washington's 4 major newspapers of the era: the Evening Star, the Intelligencer, the Republican, and the Chronicle, as well as the short-lived but crucial paper that Frederick Douglass edited here called the New Era, or the New National Era. There was a moment of revelation when I realized that an African-American AME church newspaper called the Christian Recorder, which was published in Philadelphia, was here, but it wasn't in the newspaper room, it was in the periodicals room. So I trekked back to the Jefferson building to look at the AME Christian Recorder and found amazing materials on Civil War Washington that had never been used in published research. The correspondent for the Christian Recorder in Washington during the Civil War was a minister named Henry McNeil Turner, who's best known for his post-Civil War interest in black migration to Liberia. But during the Civil War, he was an activist, pastor, AME minister in Israel Church, which was just a couple blocks south of the Capitol. And he sent these weekly dispatches to the Christian Recorder that illuminated all kinds of things about the black community in Washington's excitement, about the possibility that the war could lead to emancipation, about what African Americans were doing to open their institutions to the many refugees that were coming into the city during the war, including an amazing story of a group that turned over their church to be used as housing by refugees, basically fugitives from slavery who were coming into the district. And then smallpox in the winter of 1862 broke out among that group of people staying in the church, so the church community had to kind of shut down the church and stop using it as a church. While the smallpox was going around. And then the church gathered money to pay for the burials of the people who died. And in the spring, when smallpox was over, they cleaned up the church and reopened it for worship. But stories like that really had never been mentioned or told in the literature were there before me, as I read this, the Christian Recorder on the microfilm reader in the periodicals reading room. So I started this journey toward really understanding the depth of the collections here. And I had really the good fortune to be a Kluge Fellow. After I finished my dissertation, I had a postdoctoral fellowship in the Kluge Center. And so that was the year that I really kind of delved very, very deeply into the collections and also got to know the staff a lot better. Okay, so the product of all this research has been a couple of articles that are published in scholarly journals, and most importantly to me, this book, which deals primarily with race and politics in Washington from 1861 to 1878. Now this, I just want to show you, this is the city that we're talking about, much smaller than what we now know to be Washington, D.C. Here's Florida Avenue, and so those arrows pointing to Florida, which was then called Boundary Street, what was north of there was very rural, wasn't really considered part of the urban area of Washington City. In fact, it was a different jurisdiction. The surrounding kind of diamond shape was called Washington County. It was governed separately from the city of Washington, which was governed separately from Georgetown. And there's Teddy Roosevelt Island, which was then called Anacostia Island, and there's Georgetown, which was a separate municipality. So you can see that it was a smaller urban area geographically, and even it's a little bit of a fantasy. The areas in far northwest were not all that densely settled either. So there was a grid there, but not necessarily dense settlement throughout that area. Now, the history of Washington as a city has been rather neglected in general. For the period that I write about, the Capitol was the center of crucial debates about race and rights, and yet there's been very little scholarship about it. The last significant book the last book, period, on Washington during Reconstruction and the politics of Reconstruction was published in 1958. It's called Uncivil War, and it came out just at the cusp of a real wholesale kind of revision of our understandings of Reconstruction history. There's also been a number of black community studies that came out in the 80s, which generally didn't traced, kind of working from a more demographic perspective, traced occupations, literacy, income, and so on of African Americans, but didn't necessarily connect back to the larger story of Reconstruction. At the same time, most studies of Washington haven't really explored the national ramifications of the district's history. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which I know we're all very familiar with now, that it's recently been read on the House floor, gives Congress ultimate legislative jurisdiction in the Capitol. Federalism keeps Congress's power vis-a-vis the states in check. But in the Capitol, as we all know, there are no such checks on Congress's power. This can be very annoying to residents of the district. But more than that, it can tell us a great deal about the intentions of any given Congress. What Congress chooses to do to DC says a lot about the direction that Congress wants to head, what it thinks is important, for better or for worse. So as a graduate student, I thought working on Washington between 1861 and 1878, approximately, would make an excellent study. And in years of research and kind of thinking about it, I've come up with, discovered a lot of exciting stories and also developed some of my own interpretations of why this history matters. So one of the things I emphasize is the district as an example for all the land, the ways in which congressional power made the district an important place, not just for local history, but for the nation as a whole. Another theme that runs through the book is the debate about the meanings of equality following slave emancipation. Now, this is a kind of new direction in Reconstruction history, which has traditionally been focused around questions of freedom. About the meanings of recent history of Reconstruction has looked a lot at the meanings of freedom. My angle on this is rather to look at arguments over the extent to which governments should implement policies that would equalize people's status in various kinds of ways. Mostly I look at questions of racial equality. To what extent would either the local government or the federal government pass legislation and enforce the legislation that would eradicate the institutions, the discriminatory institutions that were left over from slavery? To what extent would they do that, and to what extent would they not do that? So racial equality, questions of racial equality are kind of foremost in the book, but I also look at how questions of equality played out in regard to gender, and that is there was a focus primarily on what the women's suffrage movement was doing this time and the relationship between racial equality and women's claims to political equality, and also to some extent questions about economic inequality. If one of the lasting effects of slavery was a lot of former slaves who had absolutely no property, few skills, and faced a discriminatory hiring policies by employers, how could the economic inequality that came out of slavery be remedied, and would it be remedied at all? These were all questions. They sound very current, they sound very contemporary, but these were all really important questions that were debated during the Civil War and in the years after the Civil War. There's a lot of emphasis on African Americans' activism in this book, because what I found was that Black Washingtonians were at the forefront of demanding an expansive vision of equality. that they were not content to settle for a superficial version of equality, to settle for just merely eradicating discriminatory laws. They wanted to go further, and the book really gets into that. I look at formal kinds of political participation, like being in the Republican Party, participating in party politics, but also petitions, street protests, parades, and kind of the whole gamut of the ways people express themselves politically in this period. And I look at 3 levels. I look at what the federal government was doing, what the local government was doing, and what was going on in popular politics. So a lot of times what I'm working across is these 3 different levels of politics, which in Washington, almost like nowhere else, kind of come together and are in conversation with each other. So I want to outline for you the kind of basic chronology and the arc of the story that the book tells. And then after I do that, I'm going to talk most specifically about what was going on during the Civil War years. So I made this timeline and divided the history that I write about into 4 basic sections, but there's really 5. So the first one is the Civil War years, which I'm going to go into in greater detail in a few minutes. But I see this as the beginning years of the legislative change and the popular politics that would characterize and really shape the post-war period. So I'll get into that more in a little while. The second major period I have here is called Radical Reconstruction. And the reason it starts in 1867 is because that's when African American men in Washington, D.C. were enfranchised, got the right to vote. And so local politics changed dramatically when black men were enfranchised. There had been, since the early 19th century, a local elected mayor and city council. And once African American men were able to vote, when they had never been able to vote before, and at about 1/3 of the population, they could really shape the way local politics worked. Now, but you see that there's that space between the two, because I didn't know what to call the period from 1865 to 1867. It's sometimes called presidential reconstruction, if you remember your history books, but I've made a little, Okay, so we have black men's voting rights. Now, I made a blue line for that strange period, that little interlude. But what I want to say in that period is that the same kinds of popular kind of groundswells of demands for greater rights and greater equality that characterized the war years continued into the post-war years before black men were enfranchised. So in other words, we didn't need to see voting rights come into place in order to see politics going on. And one representation of that is this parade, this celebration, which is on the cover of my book. It's the Emancipation Day celebration from 1866. So every year, the district, as you probably know, had its own emancipation in April 16th, 1862. That was a law passed by Congress in advance of the Emancipation Proclamation. So every year, African Americans in Washington celebrated the anniversary of emancipation, but in 1866, it was particularly potent and delightful because it was also right after the passage of the first federal Civil Rights Act to be passed, the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And so this is just an example that I want to show you of how people came pouring into the streets. There were militias, there were bands, there were Odd Fellows clubs, there were floats, there were beauty queens, all different kinds of organizations represented in a parade like this that would culminate in McPherson Square. And there would be speakers, right? And on this particular occasion in 1866, not only did they have local black leaders, but also congressmen and senators, radical Republicans were there speaking to the crowd and addressing them for the first time as citizens because of the passage of the Civil Rights Act. So this is all going on before black men get to vote. This is a fairly well-known cartoon, also from Harper's Weekly, that shows the beginning of black men's voting rights in Washington. It's kind of in a caricature type of mode where it shows an African-American man depositing his ballot in one of these boxes, and you can see actually that at the time people knew there was no secret ballot. Everybody knew who you were voting for. You would stand in line and then put your ticket in one or the other little repository, and so everybody could see who you were voting for, and the man behind him is a kind of stereotypical white Republican with his top hat, a kind of upstanding guy. And then over on the left-hand side, you see Andrew Johnson holding his veto, the president holding his veto because he had vetoed black men's voting rights in D.C., and a guy with a CSA hat kind of standing next to him, being very grumpy about what's going on. So with the onset of Blackmans Enfranchisement in 1867, the political scene in terms of formal politics and political power in the district changed dramatically. From that time until 1871, which I'll talk about in a minute, African American men, who composed about a third of the population, were able to shape the way city politics worked. There were black men elected to the city council. For 2 years, from 1868 to 1870, there was a radical Republican mayor, a white man from New York State named Sales Bowen. And some of the policies implemented in this regime revolved around improving the kind of dual strategy of improving the city through paving and grading public works projects that would also put people to work, because there was a severe unemployment problem in Washington. There were lots of former slaves in Washington, not enough jobs, and so they saw city improvements and public works projects as a way of putting people to work while at the same time building the city. The city council also passed local civil rights legislation. There was just a general focus on kind of what we would now call progressive policies. So what I want to underscore is that when black men got the right to vote, they really changed that, really, because whites tended to be split between the two parties. So Blackmans Enfranchisement really changed the balance of power in local politics. Now, at the same time, though, it basically immediately, even before black men got the vote, but certainly after, with increasing intensity, there was an organized movement to undermine a lot of this. And it was organized, it was a bipartisan movement organized by white moderate Republicans and Democrats who didn't like what was going on. And the leader of this coalition is somebody who may be familiar to you, Alexander Shepard, who led the coalition to basically dismantle the changes that were going on as a result of Reconstruction. And so just as a few years earlier, Congress had been willing to go along with or kind of help lead the way in progressive legislation that would make the district kind of a more democratic place, by the end of the 1860s and certainly by 1871, Shepard and this coalition of moderates and conservatives were able to persuade Congress to do quite the opposite. And in 1871, Congress completely transformed the structure of the district's governments, combining the three jurisdictions that I mentioned earlier into one jurisdiction called the Territory of the District of Columbia. Okay, and that was done at the behest of Shepard and others who wanted to diminish the power of voters in order to have business leaders have more control over what direction the city was headed. And so the territorial government actually had very few elected representatives. The only elected representatives in the territorial government were in the lower house. There was sort of a legislature and in the lower house, but that lower house had very little power in comparison to the vast majority of officials, all of whom were appointed. So the territorial period, which was from 1871 to 1874, I call this the first period of redemption in the District of Columbia. This is the first kind of stage of, in Reconstruction history writ large, we talk about redemption as the period in which Democrats kind of came together to dismantle the Reconstruction governments that had been set up in the South. And so DC had its own redemption, and I argue that Shepard was a leader of those redeemers. Now, the second stage happened beginning in 1874 when Congress decided that actually the territorial government wasn't working very well after all and established a commission form for the government. Okay, so probably a lot of you who have lived here for a while know the history, or at least the 20th century history of the commissioners and the commission form of government in DC. This is the second stage of redemption. The form of government that ended up governing the district for the next 99 years until home rule returned to Washington was actually the result of these dynamics of the Reconstruction period and the result of these struggles over political power and an effort in the end by wealthy leaders of Washington who would prefer to have no one be allowed to exercise the right to vote than to have a biracial electorate that was 33% African American. And so, as the timeline suggests, that extends all the way into the 20th century. Okay, so that's the overall. In 1878, the commissioners are temporary beginning in 1874, and in 1878, that form of government is made permanent. Okay, so that's the overall trajectory that the book traces. It's a kind of rise and fall story that ends on a very depressing note in a lot of ways. Now, for the remainder of the talk, I'm going to focus on the beginning of the story, the Civil War years, as a way of showing you something about how I approach my materials and also how I think about the history itself. Just a sec. So what I'm going to talk about is how the political and military vicissitudes of the war began the transformation of Washington from being an example of slaveholders' power into being an example of racial egalitarianism. The segment I'm going to talk about shows the convergence of top-down and bottom-up change. That is, it shows kind of grassroots mobilization and also legislative change from Congress. And it shows the interactions of the federal, local, and street-level politics. This segment also illustrates Washington's unusual situation as a laboratory for congressional experimentation. It reveals in particular how a dramatically new legislative majority sought to reshape D.C. in the way that it wanted, how it sought to make Washington an example for all the land. And any segment of this book would allow me to highlight research I did at the Library of Congress, but this one does as well. All the pictures I've shown so far, except for the picture of the shepherd statue, are from the Library of Congress's collections. And this one is also, and all the rest are going to be. I really like wartime pictures of the unfinished Capitol dome because they suggest a fragile nation that hasn't yet been completed, that's under construction. This was taken in 1861-62. These pictures also remind me of a description Walt Whitman penned of Washington during the Civil War. He wrote, "The city, the spaces, buildings, etc., make no unfit emblem of our country. So far, so broadly planned, everything in plenty, money and materials staggering with plenty, but the fruit of the plans, the knit, the combination yet wanting." Witnessing throngs of uniformed military men in the capital of the Republic in 1862, one reporter noted, quote, that the government, for the nonce at least, is one of naked force. What struck many people about the onset of the Civil War in Washington was the transformation of the civilian city into a military garrison. The Army enforced martial law, soldiers encamped in the Capitol building itself and on the outskirts of the city, and laborers worked to complete the series of 68 forts to ring the Capitol. The city suddenly became home to thousands of mules, hogs, cattle, and the drivers and teamsters who managed them. And this was a cartoon from Frank Leslie's that the unfinished Washington Monument with cows grazing. It says Beef Depot Monument. Prices of food and lodging skyrocketed. Wounded soldiers filled the city as the battlefront approached and then receded and then drew closer again. The Capitol was at the heart of the Union's war efforts, and its fortunes would rise or fall with the entire nation. But as dramatic as the militarization of the Capitol was, it was the political and social upheavals that began during the war that would have the most enduring consequences. The secession of 11 slaveholding states cleared the way for a new legislative agenda in Congress, and radical Republicans quickly sought to transform the Capitol from a citadel of slavery into a symbol of the far-reaching possibilities of emancipation. Policy changes, combined with the dramatic migration of thousands of fugitives from slavery into the Capitol, opened unprecedented opportunities for African Americans to demand forms of equality that sometimes converged with, but often exceeded those of radicals in Congress. Now, this is a picture that I found in the London Illustrated News in December of 1861 here at the library. And American scholars haven't used the London Illustrated News very much for Civil War illustrations, but I had read in somebody else's book that it had some really good ones. So when I was a Kluge Fellow, I asked if I could see it, and they said, well, come back in the stacks. It was one of those few opportunities when you actually got to go back there. And I was leafing through trying to see what was there, and I found this illustration, which I think is really neat. It's called Drumming Out a Soldier, and the main focus in the center of a picture is white soldiers with a guy who tried to desert. But ringing the picture are the residents of Washington, who are all portrayed as being African American. And I thought it was really interesting that this artist, presumably a British artist, when that person looked at Washington, he saw an African American city. And the more I look at it, I also am really fascinated by the relationship between the African Americans who are looking on and the white Union soldiers. This is from December of 1861, well before the Emancipation Proclamation or any kind of emancipation policy on the part of the US government. And so it's interesting to imagine whether there's some sense in the picture of expectation on the part of those black residents that maybe one day those soldiers will be fighting, not just to preserve the Union, but also for emancipation. The enormous political changes in store for the Capitol were suggested early on when the 1861 inauguration of a Republican administration and the departure of so many Confederate sympathizers allowed Northerners unprecedented influence in local affairs. From the executive mansion to the lowliest cogs in the Republican patronage machine, Republicans changed the tenor of the national Capitol. 2 Republican newspapers now flourished, and the Republicans arranged to bring abolitionist speakers to the Smithsonian's prestigious lecture series. Sales Bowen, who would later become the radical Republican mayor, marveled that, quote, every man who lectured there would have lost his head if he had dared utter the same sentiments in Washington only 1 year before. Congress quickly turned its attention to the growing paradox of slavery in the Union Capitol. The question had enormous practical urgency because the war brought thousands of slaves fleeing from Maryland and Virginia. Local police and the federal marshal for the District of Columbia, whose name was Ward Layman, he was a close friend of Lincoln's, imprisoned scores of fugitive men, women, and children, giving anti-slavery congressmen a perfect opening. Massachusetts Senator Henry Wilson and other anti-slavery legislators publicly investigated conditions where the fugitives were being held at the D.C. jail and scrutinized Layman's role in imprisoning the fugitives. The notion that slave catchers were abetted in the shadow of the Capitol was scandal enough for the editors of Frank Leslie's, not normally a very abolitionist paper, which published a 2-page spread on the inhumane conditions under which the black women and children, in particular, whose only crime was attempting to escape slavery, were imprisoned in the US Capitol. And they gave it this sensational headline, Secrets of the Prison House, the Black Hole of Washington. Again, this was something I was able to look at here, not just on microfilm, but actually look at and take a photo myself. Eventually, the photo made it into the book, and there was a professional photo taken. So on the heels of the jail controversy, Senator Wilson played a leading role in passing the District of Columbia Emancipation Act. The proposal to end slavery in the Capitol met strenuous opposition. Border state senators insisted that white District of Columbia residents be allowed to weigh in on the matter, and they argued that the proposed legislation forecast a larger agenda of emancipation on the part of Congress. The Maryland state legislature was apoplectic, and at the last minute before the bill passed, the Washington City Council passed a resolution arguing against emancipation and stating a large, quote, a large majority of the people of this district is adverse to the unqualified abolition of slavery, and encouraging Congress to prevent the city from, quote, becoming an asylum for free Negroes, a population undesirable in every American community, end quote. And obviously when they said a large majority of the people of this district, the people to them were the white people of this district, the voters, the people whom the city council represented. And that's really important when you think about the changes that were going to happen not so far in the future. Proponents of emancipation in Congress prevailed, however, and the law passed. Lincoln signed it into law on April 16, 1862. Now, the Emancipation Act had a couple of features that are historians have always found kind of interesting. I'm not going to talk about them in detail, but it appropriated $100,000 send African Americans outside the country, a nod to the fact that many Republicans still didn't think that blacks and whites could get along peacefully in the United States. It also included compensation to slave owners, the only instance of compensated emancipation in the United States. And most interestingly for our purposes, it also allowed African Americans to testify in the hearings about ownership that were going to ensue in front of this Board of Commissioners. And so in other words, actually there was a really small step, but a significant one nevertheless, toward legal equality in allowing black testimony, which had never before been allowed in Washington. So as that final clause suggested, abolitionist legislators were not content to stop with emancipation. What they were actually doing was trying to set up a legislative agenda that abolitionists in the North had been developing for decades. They had a vision of formal and expansive racial equality that had rarely been attempted, even in the North. So right after passing the Emancipation Act, Wilson introduced legislation to establish public schools for black children in the capital. This had been a subject of controversy for a long time. The bottom line was there weren't any. There were public schools for white children, none for blacks. This established a segregated school system, but the best, at very least, there were, for the first time, black public schools, or there were going to be. And then also in the spring of 1862, Congress overturned the racially discriminatory black codes that had long circumscribed the lives of free blacks in the capital. Congress actually first encouraged the Washington City Council to overturn the black codes because the black codes were actually first the creature of the City Council. But the City Council refused, and so Congress, using its power given to it by the Constitution, went ahead and overrode the City Council. The new law established, quote, that all persons of color shall be subject and amenable to the same laws and ordinance to which free white persons are. And then it went on to say that you can't have different crimes for different groups of people and different punishments for different groups of people. And what I want to underline here is that this may seem obvious to us now, but this is the beginning of a concerted effort to dismantle not just slavery itself, but the legacies of slavery, discriminatory laws, the lack of education, right? So it's a broader vision than just saying, okay, well, slavery's over and now that's all we need to do. Everybody can go and live their lives on their own. So what's going on here is that secession had brought into power a Republican coalition that, however fractured it was, and it was setting out to dramatically transform the District of Columbia. This is clearly undemocratic in the sense that it violated the wishes of the white majority. On the other hand, the structure of the local government itself was very undemocratic in the sense that it didn't allow for one large portion of the population to vote simply based on race. Now, I want to now emphasize that if the legislative change had a momentum rooted in the results of the 1860 elections, there was also another kind of momentum at work on the streets and in the public places of Washington. Thousands of fugitives from slavery were migrating to the wartime capital, and these people provided popular momentum to continue to dismantle the legal scaffolding of slavery. This is a famous picture of formerly enslaved people basically taking flight, grabbing their belongings and whatever transportation they could, and moving to where they could find more freedom. And in this particular picture, you can see tents in the background. Those are Union Army tents, and the idea is that they're moving toward Union lines where they'll find more freedom. But it's kind of representative of the larger sense that there's this huge migration going on as the war touches Maryland and Virginia. This migration is traceable in broad population shifts, not just in Washington, but across the region. In Washington, the black population between 1860 and 1870 grew more than in any other city, both in relative and absolute terms. During that decade, about 29,000 new black residents moved to the capital. And this wasn't just a temporary bulge. The population continued to grow after 1870, though, at a smaller rate. So whereas in 1860, Washington was about 20% African American, in 1870 it was about 33% African American, and that percentage or ratio held steady through, actually basically held steady till the 1950s when whites began to leave the city en masse. The fate of the thousands of fugitives arriving in the capital remained uncertain even after emancipation, even after the Emancipation Act had passed. because at this time the Union policy was making a distinction between loyal slave owners, particularly from Maryland, because the Union government wanted to keep Maryland in the Union, so didn't want to alienate those loyal slaveholders from Maryland, versus secessionist slaveholders from Virginia who were out of the Union, right? So the safety of the Maryland slaves who made it into the district was actually a subject of huge controversy. Were those loyalist slave owners from Maryland going to be allowed to come into DC and get their escaped property back? Now, there was a clash between what the local officials wanted to do, which was to enforce the fugitive slave law, which would give back these escaped slaves to their Maryland slave owners, and the military authorities, which tended to be less interested in enforcing the fugitive slave law and more interested in setting African-American migrants to work on military fortifications. So the military governor, a guy named James Wadsworth, was actually kind of an abolitionist, and he got into a lot of clashes with the local government that wanted to keep enforcing the fugitive slave law. But interestingly, there was also a lot of popular activism around attempted renditions of fugitive slaves. And this is this is a close-up of the illustration that's on the cover of my book, but I like it because it shows African Americans in a variety of different kinds of clothes. It represents class distinctions among Washington's African Americans. There are people in this illustration who have on kind of very modest clothing, and then people with very fancy clothing. And this is a diverse community where people have lots of different kinds of antecedents. There are some people who are newly escaped from slavery, and there are others who have been free and lived in Washington for a really long time. So crowds of African Americans gathered to pursue the slave catchers who came into Washington. They followed them to City Hall and filled the courtrooms for hearings before the fugitive slave commissioners. So great was the popular interest among African Americans that even the arrest of 2 black women for fighting drew a great crowd. Thinking the women were being apprehended as fugitives, the crowd brought, quote, rocks, sticks, and every imaginable missile, end quote, but then desisted on discovering the real reason for the arrests. A correspondent for the Christian Recorder, the AME newspaper I mentioned earlier, wrote, "Had it been a slave catcher, sad would have been his condition." Members of the black elite may or may not have participated in these crowds, but they definitely did arrange to post bond for people who were arrested, sometimes as much as $1,000. And they also presented a decorative cane to a white lawyer who doggedly represented these fugitive slaves in court. And these kind of crowd actions had an effect on the ability of officials to enforce the policy. The National Republican, not a particularly abolitionist paper, wrote, quote, "It has become manifest that the Fugitive Slave Act cannot be enforced here without excitements and collisions, which will be lamentable and may even be dangerous to the public peace." And other editors also commented that it was becoming impossible because of these confrontations to actually enforce the law. I'm going to skip a little part about a particular fugitive slave case, just because I want to leave a little time for questions and answers. In the end, fugitive slave laws technically remained in force in the Capitol until June of 1864, when Congress repealed them completely. But long before then, an informal coalition of freed people and members of the black elite, as well as sympathetic white lawyers, military officials, had all sought to nullify those laws. James Wadsworth, the military governor, could offer fugitives piecemeal protection, but in the end it was the crowds that made the more persuasive case by drawing public attention to the injustice of the renditions and discrediting the slave catchers and their abettors. So popular activism during the Civil War continued. Black soldiers and others protested discrimination on the city streetcars. African Americans insisted on their equal right to attend sessions of Congress and New Year's Day soirees at the White House. And African American churches, educational associations, and civic associations paraded in public in ways unimaginable just a few years earlier. Congress remained more or less on their side until about 1869 or 1870. But Congress's sentiments soon shifted, and that was the kind of pivotal shift that made it possible for Shepard and his coalition to persuade Congress to completely change the structure of the district government and turn it into a territory. So by 1871, as Congress backed away from the democratic goals of Reconstruction, once again, it made the Capitol an example for all the land, But this time, it was an example of elite Americans' growing doubts, very characteristic of the 1870s, about the ability of poor people in general, and African Americans in particular, to handle the responsibilities of democratic self-government. So I'm going to stop there with the kind of overview, and I just want to make one more comment about doing research here, and that is that the collections are phenomenal. I hadn't mentioned earlier the digital collections, the online collections. I've used the Congressional Globe from my Evanston home office, constantly searching and looking at the Congressional Globe, and I don't even have, yes, my library has the paper copy, but I can search it from home. The illustrations, the American Memory Project, it's remarkable what's up there, but it's the people, I think, who make this place work. Administrators like Mary Lou Reeker at the Kluge Center, archivists who know what's in their collections like Jeff Flannery and Clark Evans, the special searchers in the Kluge, for the Kluge Fellows who found stuff for me that seem to be lost. People whose names I never have known, who answer, patiently the same questions that researchers ask day after day. And I think that it's obvious that without the staff, these extraordinary collections wouldn't be available to researchers or to the general public. Without them, I would have remained as baffled as I was in those early days in the Jefferson Room. So I think, I have to say thank you to the staff who's here, who's not here, for making this research and this book possible. Thanks. So I'd love to answer any questions or hear any comments that you might have. Yeah.
Just a question about what the city looked like at that time. Was there residential segregation, legal or informal? And if there was, were there black neighborhoods, white neighborhoods, or other ethnically defined areas of the city?
Okay, so the question is about residential segregation, or to what extent was the city residentially segregated or not in this period, right? Basically. Generally, it was not particularly racially segregated in the sense that there weren't identifiable all black or all white neighborhoods. Part of the reason for that, though, is because of the alley housing situation. So you would have white people, wealthier people who were often white, living in the houses fronting on a street, and then there were these inhabited alleys in the back where poor people, servants, poor blacks and whites lived. So if you kind of did an aerial perspective on who lived in what neighborhood, you'd see a lot of mixing, but the reality was that there was a certain kind of segregation underlying that was both racial and economic. And then with the Civil War, there started to be enclaves of African Americans around the forts, and there was what's called a contraband camp, a kind of refugee camp. But residential segregation really increased under the territorial government, and the kind of development of Northwest in the area around DuPont Circle was a very working class, racially mixed neighborhood, and very sparsely settled also, I should say. But as the territorial government expanded in that direction and really built it up, property values went up, and a lot of the poorer inhabitants of that area got driven out into other areas.
I was very struck by your reading of the 1862 Act as not just an Emancipation Act, but also an effort to think about beyond emancipation. And I was wondering if there was any attempt there to draw from the experiences of northern states, particularly thinking of New York and New Jersey, which emancipated slowly and within living memory of some of the people who had been in Congress, and whether they had thought at all about the experience of ex-slaves in those states and how they had been doing by the 1860s.
That's a good question. And in the congressional debates, so the question is, to what extent were Northerners in Congress thinking about the experiences of emancipation in the North and the fate of free blacks in the North as they were legislating for D.C.? I don't recall reading any direct references to that, but I do think of a colleague of mine named Steve Kantowitz has just written a book about the sort of Black abolitionism and kind of the broader quest for equality in and around Boston in the early 19th century. Sorry, it goes through the whole 19th century. But that book explained a lot to me about where this vision of expansive equality came from, because it was one, and you see people like Henry Wilson and Charles Sumner, who were from Massachusetts, talking about this for a long time before the Civil War. And then when the war happens and they have this opportunity to really reshape legislation, they start to try to put into practice a vision that had been floating around a long time. One, I should add that whites were sort of pushed into by Northern African Americans, particularly in New England, who saw greater possibilities, right? So there's a complicated dynamic, but there are definitely historical antecedents for what you see starting to happen in the beginning of the war. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Did your research state which building that was in and if it's still standing?
That was, the big scandal was about, oh, forget it. The big scandal was about the DC jail. It was not there was something called the Old Capitol Prison, which is around here, around where the Library of Congress now stands, and that was used as a military prison. And so some of the fugitives were first held in the Old Capitol Prison, but then at one point in the fall of 1861, they were all brought over to the jail, which is over by where Judiciary Square was, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, sorry, it was, I used the wrong verbs. It was near where Judiciary Square was and is. So that jail is not standing. In fact, it was a complete dump at the time. It was horrible. People were escaping routinely. The conditions were terrible. So I think it was torn down in the late 19th century. Yeah.
To what degree do you cover the issue of how African Americans in the District of Columbia responded to the efforts of the political elite on their behalf? What were their attitudes? To some degree, do you cover that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mean the political elite, like in Congress?
Yes.
Yeah, so, well, some elite African Americans had direct contact with the people like Sumner, and Charles Sumner in particular was well known for having really strong ties to black activists. And so, for instance, a guy named George Downing, who was also from New York and Rhode Island, he ended up, he was very interested in creating a national black lobbying organization that would be in the Capitol and would lobby Congress on black issues. And he recruited sort of black activists from around the country to come. It didn't get very far, in part because they were constantly lacking funding. But Downing was in constant, I want to say email, in constant correspondence with Sumner. And Downing also ran the refectory in the House of Representatives, in the Senate, in the House. And so and there were a number of African Americans who had kind of catering jobs and positions that, although they seem sort of lowly in some ways, they would put those people in contact with members of the white political elite. And so you can imagine that Downing is running this lunchroom in the House of Representatives. He sees congressmen all the time, and he lobbied them. So there's a lot of that. There's a military guy named Alexander Augusta, who was a physician, who also was in very close contact with some of the congressmen. So there's a fair amount of that. Now, one interesting question, though, is how much relationship people like that had to kind of the black masses in D.C., and that's also a complicated question. Back.
One, did you find many sources or some new sources on the activities of Quaker residents of the District of Columbia? I don't mean those in the suburbs or the outside of the city, but Quaker residents, long-term residents in abolition activities. And two, I just want to try to look about the Pearsons shoemakers who are a Lee family here. They own a lot of land in Mount Creek, and they were ex-Quakers actually, became slaveholders. Now they kept their heads down during the Civil War, but they stayed here. And I think this is fairly clear, although I never could really discover evidence in the letters or anything, what they felt. But they stayed, and they afterwards maybe their compromises of the situation. And on that matter, did you find many examples of elite residents who were so stayed rather than fled the city like some of them did?
Okay.
You want to summarize
Yeah. So the first question is, what did I find out about anything new about Quakers, abolitionists, and did I find Southern sympathizing white residents who stayed in the city? So on the first question, I didn't really do very much on the antebellum period anyway. I was really struck by the hostility of Washington white folks to most of these measures, and Constance Green, who wrote some of the most important books on Washington, kind of in the general history, kind of underplays that, I think, a lot. I don't know why exactly, but she sort of says, well, there's a moment in the 1830s or 40s when there's a petition or a couple of big petitions from white Washington residents for abolition. But that's kind of a fleeting moment, and the overwhelming sense is that they opposed this stuff at every turn and just barely made their peace with it. Now, being against the abolition of slavery did not make you a Confederate sympathizer, right? So there were certainly lots of white Washingtonians left Washington and fought for the Confederacy. But there were plenty who were like typical kind of Democrats, right? They were unionists, but they didn't favor any of these abolition measures or black equality or anything like that, and they did everything they could to undermine it. And so and then most of the white Republicans who were on the radical side were from the North. As far as I could tell, like Sales Bowen, the radical Republican mayor, but many, many others of them were actually of Northern origin. Now, I wouldn't go so far as to say that it was 100% on one side or the other, but I didn't find very many white natives of Washington they may have been Republicans, like Alexander Shepard was a Republican, but who were on the radical side of the kind of Republican divide.
You mentioned a petition against abolition?
In favor of abolition.
There's also a petition against abolition by white residents.
I'm sure. Yeah. Yes.
So just to follow that, when Boss Shepard came along, was there any white ambivalence about losing home rule and democracy, or was it all through the prism of race?
Okay, so when Boss Shepard came along, was there any white ambivalence about losing democracy, or was it all through the prism of race? The answer to that is that African Americans and the white radicals who remained by the early 1870s opposed Shepard and the consolidation movement. That's another thing. Green mysteriously says that by the time 1871 rolled around, Washingtonians were so sick of home rule that they readily gave it up. That's not true. I mean, it's empirically not true. There was a huge amount of opposition to what Shepard was trying to do. A lot of the most vocal and the most kind of, well elaborated was from African Americans, but it also came from whites who either were radical in their ideology or had an investment, were like councilmen who had an investment in the existing system of city government. Yeah, so there was some opposition, but they got kind of slammed by the forces of the coalition. And not only that, I should say that there were legitimate reasons to complain about the radical Republican rule. There was a lot of debt, and the city was in great debt, and so it was becoming hard to get things done, to get the money to get things done and stuff. So it's a little more complicated than, kind of good guys, bad guys, although not that much more.
One more question? Anyone?
Yeah.
Here we go.
Talking about radical Republicans and listening to your description of this period, it seems to me or that side, I guess I can say, won the legislative struggle but lost the propaganda issue. Because it doesn't seem as though it's a compliment.
To call them radicals?
Yeah.
They're...
Then or now.
Right. I guess, it's a good point, and there's been some debate about that, but when they're called radical Republicans, first of all, they're called that in the context of their time, right? That they were radical in the sense that they wanted to see, and this is not just for Washington, but kind of writ large, they wanted to see the most dramatic changes to the South, kind of more rather than less federal intervention in the post-Confederate South, and more rather than less racial equality. Now, by our standards, those guys, well, on the racial equality thing, they're not very radical. On the federal government thing, by today's standards, they might still be a little bit radical. But there weren't very many of them who were, well, anyway, that's a sort of tangent. Anyway, so, but you make a good point that by calling them radicals, it doesn't necessarily, I mean, it doesn't necessarily advertise them in the best possible way, except we need to understand that when we say radical, it's that they're radical in relationship to their own time and in comparison to what other Republicans, which are often called moderate or conservative Republicans, were advocating. Okay, so thank you very much. This has been fun.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.